Arthur Morales stared at the most beautiful alien woman he had ever seen, frozen in stasis beneath layers of ancient ice. His heart raced as he realized the magnitude of his discovery on this desolate wasteland planet. Just hours earlier, Arthur had been fighting for survival. His ship, part of Earth's interstellar expansion program, malfunctioned during a routine scouting mission. The craft plummeted through Zephiria's atmosphere, metal shrieking as it tore apart. Arthur barely managed to guide the failing vessel to a semi-controlled crash on the planet's icy surface. He emerged from the wreckage, battered but alive. Zephiria's harsh environment assaulted him immediately, howling winds carrying ice shards that stung his exposed skin, sub-zero temperatures that seeped through his suit. Arthur salvaged what he could from the ship, grimacing as he discovered his distress beacon was damaged beyond repair. He was truly alone, stranded on this frozen rock with dwindling supplies and no way to call for help. Using debris from the crash, Arthur cobbled together a makeshift shelter. As he worked, his scanner picked up unusual energy readings emanating from beneath the ice. Curiosity overcame caution. If there was something down there, some resource or technology, it might be his only chance at survival. Arthur began to dig. Hours passed as he chipped away at the unyielding surface. Just as his strength was about to give out, his tools broke through into a hidden cavern. An alien structure lay revealed, its architecture unlike anything in humanity's database. Heart pounding, Arthur entered the ancient facility. Banks of unfamiliar technology lined the walls, inert but intact. In the center of the chamber stood a gleaming stasis pod. Arthur approached cautiously, using his sleeve to wipe away millennia of frost from its surface. He gasped. Inside lay a female humanoid alien, her features both familiar and exotic. Her skin was a pale lavender, with iridescent patterns swirling across her face and exposed arms. Delicate antenna-like structures protruded from her forehead. Despite the alien nature of her appearance, Arthur was struck by her beauty. His mind raced. This had to be a member of the Gamelon race, an advanced civilization long thought extinct. The implications were staggering. Arthur's hand hovered over the stasis controls. The rational part of his mind screamed caution, but a deeper instinct urged him forward. He activated the revival sequence. As the pod hissed open, the alien woman's eyes fluttered. They were a startling silver with no visible pupils. Those eyes widened in fear as they focused on Arthur. She scrambled back, pressing herself against the far side of the pod. Arthur raised his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. He activated his translation device, but the alien's rapid speech pattern came through as gibberish. The Gamelon language was unknown to the database. Slowly, the alien's terror faded to curiosity. She studied Arthur intently, her gaze lingering on his five-fingered hands, the shape of his ears, the color of his skin. Arthur felt a flush creep up his neck under her scrutiny. As the alien, Linux, he would later learn was her name, grew bolder, she began to interact with the dormant systems around them. Lights flickered to life, and holographic displays sprang into existence. Arthur watched in awe as the hidden Gamelon outpost awakened after eons of slumber. The strategic value of this discovery hit Arthur like a physical blow. This outpost, this technology, could catapult humanity's interstellar ambitions forward by centuries. Yet as he looked at Linux, now engrossed in the facility's systems, Arthur felt a twinge of unease. How could he balance his duty to Earth with the rights of this last Gamelon survivor? As if sensing his gaze, Linux turned to Arthur. A small smile played at the corners of her alien mouth. In that moment, standing amidst the awakening wonders of a long-lost civilization, Arthur knew his life would never be the same. The icy wasteland of Zephyria had yielded the most precious discovery in human history, and perhaps the key to Arthur's own survival. Arthur's gaze lingered on Linux as she deftly manipulated the alien technology, her delicate fingers dancing across holographic interfaces. The initial fear in her silver eyes had given way to intense focus, and he found himself captivated by her fluid movements. "Linux," he called softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned, antenna twitching slightly. Arthur gestured to the displays around them. "This outpost, it must contain vast amounts of information about your people." Linux nodded, a series of melodic clicks and trills emanating from her throat. Arthur's translation device struggled to keep up, but he caught the gist, a database, filled with Gamelon history and technological advancements. Heart racing, Arthur pulled out his portable data storage unit. "May I?" he asked, holding up the device. Linux hesitated, then inclined her head in assent. Together they navigated the complex Gamelon systems. Arthur marveled at the sheer volume of information, scientific breakthroughs, cultural records, and technological schematics beyond humanity's wildest dreams. As the data flowed into his device, he felt a mix of excitement and unease. This knowledge could propel humanity forward by centuries, but at what cost to Linux and her people? Their exploration led them deeper into the outpost. Rounding a corner, Arthur's jaw dropped. Before them stood a massive hangar bay, and within it, a sleek spacecraft unlike anything he'd ever seen. "Is that?" he breathed, unable to finish the question. Linux chirped an affirmative, her own eyes wide with wonder. She approached the vessel, running a hand along its smooth, iridescent surface. Arthur followed, his mind racing with possibilities. This ship could be their ticket off Zephyria, but the advanced technology was far beyond his comprehension. They entered the craft, Arthur ducking to avoid the low entryway. The interior was a maze of unfamiliar controls and pulsing light patterns. Linux moved with more confidence, but even she seemed uncertain about some of the systems. As they worked to decipher the ship's functions, Arthur found himself increasingly aware of Linux's proximity. In the cramped cockpit, their bodies often brushed against each other. During one such moment, their hands touched as they reached for the same control panel. Linux recoiled as if shocked, a high-pitched trill escaping her. Arthur stepped back, hands raised. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. "I didn't mean to startle you." Linux's antenna flattened against her head, her silver eyes wide. Arthur realized he needed to explain. In human culture, accidental touches like that are common and harmless, he said gently. "We have different ideas about personal space than you seem to." This led to a barrage of questions from Linux. Her curiosity about humans was insatiable, and Arthur found himself explaining everything from handshakes to hugs to kissing. When he broached the topic of human mating practices, Linux's reaction was a mix of fascination and horror. "Wait," Arthur said, struggling to follow her rapid-fire response. "You're saying gamelons reproduce through genetic recombination, without physical contact?" Linux nodded emphatically, gesturing to her smooth, featureless torso. Arthur's cheeks flushed as he realized the implications. "Well," he coughed, "that's certainly different." Their conversation was cut short by a sudden blaring alarm. Red lights flashed throughout the hangar as heavy doors began to slide shut. Arthur lunged for the exit, but it was too late. They were sealed inside. "What happened?" he shouted over the noise. Linux's fingers flew over a nearby console, her expression grim. Through the translator, Arthur understood they had triggered some sort of security protocol. The entire outpost was now in lockdown. Hours passed as they worked to override the system. The close quarters and shared air supply made Arthur acutely aware of Linux's alien presence. He noticed the way her lavender skin seemed to shimmer under certain lights, the graceful arch of her neck as she leaned over controls. Despite their physiological differences, he found himself undeniably drawn to her. Linux, too, seemed affected by their proximity. Her gaze often lingered on Arthur's hands or the curve of his jaw. When they were forced to share the ship's small sleeping quarters, her antenna twitched nervously, and she kept a careful distance between them. As Arthur pored over the outpost systems, searching for a way to lift the lockdown, he made a startling discovery. "Linux," he called, excitement overriding his exhaustion. "Look at this." On the screen before them was a map of the galaxy, dotted with pulsing lights. Each one, Arthur realized, represented a Gamelon outpost like this one. "Your people," he said softly. "They might still be out there." Linux's eyes widened, a series of rapid clicks conveying her shock and hope. But as they delved deeper into the data, their elation turned to concern. Historical records spoke of a devastating war between the Gamelons and another advanced race. The threat, it seemed, might still exist, endangering both their species. The weight of their discoveries pressed down on them. In the dim light of the ship's cabin, Arthur found Linux trembling, her antenna drooping. Without thinking, he reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. This time she didn't pull away. Instead, Linux leaned into his touch, her silver eyes meeting his. Arthur felt a jolt of electricity pass between them, transcending their biological differences. As the ship's systems hummed softly around them, human and Gamelon drew closer, the universe of possibilities stretching out before them. As the ship's systems continued to hum softly around them, Arthur and Linux reluctantly broke apart, the urgency of their situation reasserting itself. They returned to the task of overriding the lockdown protocols, their movements now charged with a new awareness of each other. Hours passed as they worked tirelessly, the strain of their efforts beginning to show. Arthur's breathing grew labored, his movements sluggish. Linux noticed his deteriorating condition with mounting concern. "Arthur," she chirped, her antenna twitching nervously. "You unwell?" He tried to wave off her worry, but a violent coughing fit betrayed him. "I'm fine," he wheezed unconvincingly. "Just need to rest a bit." Linux's silver eyes narrowed, her gaze sweeping over Arthur's form. She activated a nearby console, her fingers dancing across the holographic interface. A series of symbols flashed across the screen, and her expression grew grave. "Danger," she trilled urgently. "Zephyria toxins in your system. Need treatment." Arthur's eyes widened as the implications sank in. His protective gear must have been compromised during the crash, allowing Zephiria's harsh atmosphere to slowly poison him. "But how?" he asked, his voice weak. "We're locked in here." Linux's antenna perked up suddenly. She gestured for Arthur to follow her, leading him deeper into the outpost. They passed through winding corridors until they reached a hidden panel. With a few deft movements, Linux activated a mechanism, revealing a secret chamber. As the door slid open, Arthur gasped. Before them lay a fully equipped Gamelon medical bay, its pristine surfaces gleaming under soft ambient lighting. Linux guided Arthur to a central examination table, her movements purposeful and assured. You know how to use this equipment?" Arthur asked, his breath coming in short gasps. Linux nodded, her fingers already flying over the control panels. "Basic training," she explained. "All Gamelons learn." As the medical systems came to life around them, Linux hesitated. She gestured to Arthur's protective suit, her antenna flattening against her head. "Must remove," she said softly. "For treatment." Arthur nodded, understanding her apprehension. He began to peel off the layers of his gear, his movements clumsy with fatigue. Linux stepped forward to assist, her hands trembling slightly as they made contact with Arthur's exposed skin. The touch sent a jolt through both of them. Linux's eyes widened at the unexpected warmth radiating from Arthur's body. Her fingers lingered, tracing the contours of his arms with fascination. Arthur felt a flush creep up his neck, acutely aware of Linux's exploration. As the last of his gear fell away, he noticed a change in the air. A subtle, sweet scent wafted from Linux's skin, growing stronger with each passing moment. Linux seemed equally affected, her silver eyes dilating as she inhaled deeply. "What happening?" she asked, her voice husky. "I think," Arthur said, his own senses heightening, "your body is releasing pheromones. It's a chemical response, usually tied to attraction in humans." Linux's antenna twitched rapidly, processing this information. "Gamelons, no such response," she said, her gaze fixed on Arthur, "but feel strange, warm." Their faces drew closer, the air between them charged with possibility. But before they could explore this new development further, Arthur's body was racked with another coughing fit. The moment shattered, Linux sprang into action. She guided Arthur onto the examination table, activating a series of scanners. Holographic displays sprang to life, showing detailed images of Arthur's internal systems. Linux's expression grew focused as she interpreted the data, her earlier hesitation replaced by drive. As Linux worked to counteract the Zephirian toxins, Arthur found himself mesmerized by her movements. The graceful arc of her neck, the delicate touch of her fingers as she adjusted controls and administered treatments. Each action seemed to draw him in further. "Linux?" he said softly, as she finished applying a healing salve to his chest. "Can I ask you something?" She paused, her antenna quirking inquisitively. "Ask," she encouraged. "How do gamelons, without physical contact, how does your species—" Arthur trailed off, unsure how to phrase his question delicately. Lennox's skin flushed a deeper shade of lavender. "Reproduction?" she asked, her voice a mix of embarrassment and curiosity. At Arthur's nod, she continued, "Genetic material extracted, combined in laboratory, new gamelons grown in gestation chambers." Arthur's eyebrows rose. "So no physical intimacy at all?" Lennox shook her head. "Not for reproduction, but—" She hesitated, her antenna twitching nervously. "Have heard of recreational contact. Rare. Considered deviant by many." The implications hung heavy in the air between them. Arthur opened his mouth to respond, but was cut off by a violent tremor that shook the entire outpost. Alarms blared to life, red warning lights bathing the medical bay in an eerie glow. Lennox rushed to a nearby console, her fingers flying over the controls. Her eyes widened in horror as she interpreted the data. "Ice shelf fracturing," she explained urgently. "Outpost stability compromised." Arthur leapt from the examination table, his strength partially restored by Lennox's treatments. "We need to get back to the ship," he said, already moving towards the exit. As they raced through the corridors, the outpost groaned and shuddered around them. Chunks of ice and debris rained down, forcing them to dodge and weave. They were nearly to the hangar when a metallic whir caught Arthur's attention. "Look out!" he shouted, tackling Lennox to the ground as a security drone swooped overhead, its weapons primed. The drone's targeting systems, confused by the outpost's deterioration, had identified them as intruders. Arthur's body pressed against Lennox's, shielding her as the drone opened fire. He felt a searing pain in his shoulder as a blast grazed him, but he didn't move. Lennox's eyes met his, wide with a mixture of fear and something deeper. Using the debris as cover, they managed to disable the malfunctioning drone. As the immediate danger passed, Lennox's attention turned to Arthur's injury. Her touch was gentle as she examined the wound, her earlier reservations about physical contact forgotten in her concern. "Must treat," she insisted, her voice thick with worry. Arthur shook his head. "No time," he said, gesturing to the crumbling walls around them. "We have to reach the ship." They made it to the hangar, Arthur leaning heavily on Lennox for support. Their relief at seeing the Gamelon spacecraft was short-lived, however. A large section of the ceiling had collapsed, crushing part of the ship's hull. Lennox's antenna drooped as she assessed the damage. "Can repair," she said, persistence creeping into her voice, "but need components from other parts of Outpost." Arthur nodded grimly, understanding the risk. They would have to venture back into the deteriorating structure, braving both the collapsing ice and the malfunctioning security systems. As they gathered supplies for their perilous mission, Arthur caught Lennox's gaze. The alien beauty of her features, the courage and intelligence shining in her silver eyes. He was suddenly acutely aware of how much she had come to mean to him in their short time together. Lennox seemed to sense his thoughts, her antenna quivering slightly. She reached out, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that bridged their two species. No words were needed as they prepared to face the dangers that lay ahead, both knowing that whatever challenges awaited them, they would face them together. Together, with a shared nod of persistence, they set out into the crumbling outpost. The corridors groaned under the strain of shifting ice as Arthur and Lennox made their way deeper into the facility. Debris littered their path, forcing them to climb over fallen beams and duck under precariously hanging cables. "Watch out," Arthur called, pulling Lennox back as a section of ceiling collapsed mere inches from where she stood. Her antenna twitched in gratitude as she regained her footing. They moved in tandem, Arthur's quick reflexes complementing Lennox's knowledge of Gamelon architecture. When they encountered a sealed door, Lennox's fingers danced across the control panel, bypassing security protocols with practiced ease. "How much further?" Arthur asked, wincing as he favored his injured shoulder. Lennox consulted a holographic map projected from her wrist device. "Component storage 2 levels down," she chirped, "but unstable. Must hurry." As they descended, the tremors intensified. Ice formations crept along the walls, their crystalline structures spreading with alarming speed. Arthur marveled at their beauty, even as he recognized the danger they posed. A shrill alarm pierced the air, causing both of them to flinch. Red warning lights bathed the corridor in an eerie glow as a security drone rounded the corner, its weapons primed. "Down!" Lennox shouted, tackling Arthur to the ground as energy blasts sizzled overhead. Rolling behind a fallen support beam, Arthur searched for a way to disable the drone. His eyes landed on a loose piece of piping. With a grunt of effort, he hurled it at the drone's sensors, throwing off its targeting systems. Lennox seized the opportunity, leaping forward with startling agility. Her hands found hidden access panels on the drone's chassis, and with a series of rapid movements, she deactivated it. "Impressive," Arthur said, admiration clear in his voice. Lennox's skin flushed a deeper shade of lavender. "Basic training," she replied modestly. They pressed on, finally reaching the component storage level. As they entered a vast chamber filled with Gamelon technology, Arthur's eyes widened. Row upon row of sleek, advanced weaponry lined the walls. "Lennox," he breathed, "look at this. With this kind of firepower, Earth could defend itself against any threat." He moved to examine one of the weapons, but Lennox's hand on his arm stopped him. Her silver eyes were filled with concern. "Arthur," she said softly, "Gamelon weapons too powerful. Humans not ready." Arthur felt a flicker of frustration. "Not ready? We've been attacked, our planet nearly destroyed. Don't we deserve a chance to protect ourselves?" Lennox's antenna drooped. "Understand your fear, but these weapons could bring more destruction, not solution." Their eyes locked, the air between them heavy with unspoken arguments. Before either could speak, a violent tremor shook the chamber. The floor buckled beneath them, splitting with a deafening crack. "Arthur!" Lennox cried out as the human lost his footing, tumbling into the widening fissure. He managed to grab onto a jagged edge, his feet dangling over empty space. Lennox lunged for him, her fingers brushing his wrist. But another tremor rocked the outpost. The floor separated completely, leaving them on opposite sides of a rapidly expanding chasm. "Find another way around," Arthur shouted as he pulled himself to safety. "I'll meet you back at the hangar." Lennox's antenna twitched in distress, but she nodded, understanding the necessity of splitting up. As the gap between them grew, Arthur watched her disappear into a side corridor. Left alone, he surveyed his surroundings. The weapons cache was now out of reach, but he noticed a blinking console nearby. Curiosity piqued, he approached it. The screen displayed a series of unfamiliar symbols, but as Arthur studied them, he realized it was some sort of communication device. He fiddled with the controls, and suddenly, a burst of static filled the air. "Outpost Zeta 9, do you copy? This is Gamelon Fleet Command. We've detected seismic activity in your sector. Respond immediately." Arthur's heart raced. The transmission confirmed what they had only hoped. Other Gamelons had survived, and they were actively searching for their lost colonies. The implications of this discovery deeply affected on him as he made his way through the crumbling corridors. Meanwhile, Lennox navigated a maze of service tunnels, her knowledge of Gamelon engineering guiding her steps. She emerged into a dimly lit chamber dominated by a pulsing, crystalline structure. As she approached, the crystal flared to life, projecting a holographic interface. Lennox gasped as she recognized it, a Gamelon artificial intelligence system. "Identify yourself," the AI intoned in her native language. "Lennox, xenobiologist, 3rd class," she responded, her antenna quivering with anticipation. The AI's tone shifted, becoming almost warm. "Greetings, Lennox. It has been 251 standard cycles since my last interaction with a Gamelon lifeform. I am pleased to see our species endures." Over the next few minutes, Lennox absorbed a flood of information about the current state of Gamelon civilization. She learned of their slow recovery from the devastating war, their ongoing conflict with the mysterious race known as the Sharkari, and their efforts to reestablish contact with lost colonies. As the AI shared details of recent Gamelon scientific advancements and military strategies, Lennox felt a renewed sense of connection to her people. Yet thoughts of Arthur tugged at her consciousness, creating a conflict she had never anticipated. The outpost shuddered, reminding Lennox of the urgency of their situation. Bidding farewell to the AI, she hurried towards the hangar, her mind racing with the implications of what she had learned. Arthur and Lennox reunited at the entrance to the hangar, both breathless from their separate journeys. As their eyes met, the tension between them was palpable. "Arthur," Lennox began, her voice tight with emotion, "Gamelon civilization still strong. My people need me." "I understand," Arthur replied, his own tone conflicted. "But Earth needs these advancements. We can't remain defenseless in a galaxy full of threats we don't understand." Their argument escalated, words growing heated as they grappled with their divided loyalties. In a moment of frustration, Arthur reached out to grasp Lennox's shoulder, forgetting her aversion to physical contact. Instinctively, Lennox recoiled, but as she did, she lost her footing on the icy floor. Arthur lunged to catch her, and they tumbled to the ground, limbs entangled. For a moment they lay there, faces inches apart, chests heaving. Lennox's antenna twitched rapidly, her silver eyes wide as she processed the proximity of Arthur's body. Then, in a move that surprised them both, Lennox leaned forward and pressed her lips to Arthur's. The kiss was unlike anything either had experienced, alien yet undeniably thrilling. Arthur's initial shock gave way to a flood of warmth as he returned the kiss, his hands gently cradling Lennox's face. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing heavily. Lennox's skin shimmered with an intensity Arthur had never seen before. I don't understand," Arthur whispered, still reeling from the unexpected intimacy. Lennox's antenna quivered. "Nor do I," she admitted, "but not unpleasant." Their moment of connection was shattered by a deep, ominous rumble that shook the entire outpost. Warning klaxons blared to life, their urgent wail echoing through the corridors. "We must hurry," Lennox said, her professional demeanor reasserting itself, even as her eyes lingered on Arthur's lips. "Outpost unstable." They scrambled to their feet, rushing to the partially damaged spacecraft. As Lennox began repairs, Arthur accessed a nearby console, his face paling as he interpreted the data. "Lennox," he called out, his voice tight with urgency, "the power core is going critical. If it blows, it'll take out half the planet's surface." Their eyes met, a silent understanding passing between them. The repairs, their newfound intimacy, the fate of their respective civilizations, all of it hinged on their ability to escape before the impending explosion. As Lennox's fingers flew over the ship's control systems, Arthur braced himself against the hull, ready to assist. The outpost groaned around them, ice cracking and metal twisting as the power core's instability grew. Time seemed to stretch and compress as they worked, every second both agonizingly long and terrifyingly brief. The growing rumble of the failing power core provided a continuous, nerve-wracking backdrop to their frantic efforts. "Just a few more minutes," Lennox chirped, her antenna twitching with concentration as she reconnected a series of delicate circuits. Arthur glanced at the console displaying the power core's status, his heart pounding as he watched the energy levels spike dangerously. "I don't think we have a few more minutes," he muttered, redoubling his efforts to assist Lennox. As they raced against time, both human and Gamelon were acutely aware of the weight of their actions, the fate of two civilizations, the potential for interstellar conflict or cooperation, and their own blossoming relationship, all hung in the balance as the outpost crumbled around them. The spacecraft's systems hummed to life, its control panels flickering with an erratic pulse that matched the unstable power surges rippling through the outpost. "Arthur, I need you to reroute auxiliary power to the propulsion systems," Lennox called out, her fingers dancing across the alien controls with practiced precision. Arthur nodded, moving to a nearby panel. As he reached for a cluster of wires, a sudden power surge sent a shower of sparks cascading over his hand. He jerked back with a sharp cry of pain, clutching his burned palm to his chest. Lennox's head snapped up at the sound, her silver eyes widening as she saw Arthur's pained expression. For a moment she hesitated, her ingrained aversion to physical contact warring with her concern for her human companion. "Let me see," she said softly, her antenna quivering as she approached him. Arthur extended his hand, wincing as Lynx gently took it in her own. Her lavender skin was cool against his, a stark contrast to the angry red burn spreading across his palm. Without a word, Lynx reached for a small device on her belt. It hummed to life, emitting a soft blue glow that enveloped Arthur's injured hand. The pain began to ebb almost immediately, replaced by a tingling sensation that spread from his fingertips to his wrist. Gamelon Dermal Regenerator, Lynx explained, her voice barely above a whisper. It will accelerate healing and prevent infection. As she worked, Arthur found himself mesmerized by the play of emotions across Lynx's alien features. Her initial hesitation had given way to a look of intense concentration, her antenna twitching slightly with each careful movement. "Thank you," Arthur said as Lynx finished her ministrations. Their eyes met, and for a moment the chaos around them seemed to fade away. The moment was shattered by a violent tremor that shook the entire hangar. A deafening crack echoed through the chamber as a fissure opened in the outer wall, exposing them to the harsh Zephyrian atmosphere. Frigid air rushed in, carrying with it a flurry of ice crystals that stung Arthur's skin. He could see his breath condensing in front of him as the temperature plummeted. "The hull breach!" Lynx cried out, her voice nearly lost in the howling wind. "If we don't seal it, we'll freeze before we can launch." Arthur's mind raced, scanning the debris-strewn hangar for anything they could use. His eyes landed on a pile of discarded metal panels near the far wall. "There," he shouted, pointing. "We can use those to patch the breach. I'll weld them in place while you finish the repairs." Lynx nodded, her antenna flattening against her head as she turned back to the spacecraft's controls. Arthur sprinted across the hangar, his movements hampered by the increasingly slippery floor. He hefted two of the panels, their weight straining his muscles as he made his way back to the breach. Using a fallen support beam as a makeshift ladder, Arthur climbed up to the crack in the wall. The wind howled around him, threatening to tear the panels from his grasp. With trembling hands, he positioned the first panel over the breach. "Lynx," he called out, "I need something to weld this in place." Without looking up from her work, Lynx tossed him a small device. Arthur caught it one-handed, recognizing it as a Gamelon energy tool. He activated it, a beam of intense heat erupting from its tip. As Arthur worked to seal the breach, Lynx's fingers flew over the spacecraft's controls. Sweat beaded on her lavender skin despite the plummeting temperature, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "Life support systems are unstable," she reported, her voice tight with tension. "The cold is affecting the power distribution." Arthur finished welding the second panel in place, the breach now sealed against the Zephyrian atmosphere. He climbed down, his limbs stiff and unresponsive from the cold. "It's done," he said, his teeth chattering, "but the temperature's still dropping." Lynx looked up, her silver eyes filled with concern. "We need to conserve body heat," she said, her antenna twitching nervously. It's the only way we'll survive long enough to complete the repairs." Arthur nodded, understanding the implications of her words. He could see the conflict playing out across Lynx's features, her need for survival warring with her innate discomfort with physical contact. "It's okay," he said softly, holding out his hand. "We're in this together, remember?" Lynx hesitated for a moment, then reached out and took his hand. They made their way to the spacecraft's cramped cockpit, huddling together in the pilot's seat. At first, Lynx's body was rigid against Arthur's, her muscles tense and unyielding. But as the minutes ticked by and their shared warmth began to combat the biting cold, she gradually relaxed. Arthur found himself acutely aware of every point of contact between them. The softness of Lynx's skin, the gentle rise and fall of her chest as she breathed, the subtle vibrations of her antenna against his cheek. "This isn't so bad, is it?" he murmured, a small smile tugging at his lips despite their dire situation. Lynx's antenna twitched, brushing against his ear in a way that sent a shiver down his spine. "It is not unpleasant," she admitted, echoing her words from their earlier kiss. Their moment of relative peace was shattered by a piercing alarm that cut through the air. Red warning lights bathed the cockpit in an eerie glow as a computerized voice began to speak in the Gamelon language. Lynx's body tensed against Arthur's. The outpost security systems, she translated, her voice tight with urgency. They're initiating a lockdown protocol in response to the imminent core explosion. Arthur's heart sank as he saw the massive hangar bay doors begin to slide shut. Can we override it? He asked, already knowing the answer would be complicated. Linux's fingers flew over the control panel, her brow furrowed in concentration. I can try to hack the security protocols, she said, but it will take time we may not have. Arthur nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. I'll see if I can rig up a manual override for the doors, he said, reluctantly disentangling himself from Linux and moving towards the exit. As they worked, a crackle of static filled the air, followed by a burst of gamelan speech. Linux's head snapped up, her antenna quivering as she listened intently. It's another transmission, she said, her voice a mix of excitement and apprehension. A gamelan rescue team is on its way to investigate the energy fluctuations on Zephyria. Arthur felt a surge of conflicting emotions at the news. On one hand, the arrival of a gamelan ship could mean salvation for both of them. On the other, it complicated their already precarious situation immensely. How long until they arrive? He asked, his hands never stopping their work on the manual override. Linux's antenna drooped slightly. Minutes at most, she replied. Arthur, we need to decide what to do. Do we wait for them and risk the core explosion, or do we try to escape on our own? Arthur paused, the weight of the decision settling heavily on his shoulders. He thought of Earth, of the potential for peaceful first contact with the gamelans. He thought of Linux, torn between her duty to her people and her growing connection to him. We can't risk waiting, he said finally, his voice firm despite the turmoil in his heart. We need to get out of here before that core blows. Linux nodded, a complex mix of emotions playing across her features. Then let's finish these repairs and get off this ice ball, she said, her voice filled with newfound purpose. As alarms blared and the facility crumbled around them, Arthur and Linux worked in perfect synchronization. Their earlier awkwardness had been replaced by a fluid efficiency, each anticipating the other's needs without a word. With a final burst of effort, they managed to override the hangar bay doors. The massive panels ground open, revealing the swirling ice and snow of Zephyria beyond. We did it, Arthur exclaimed, a grin spreading across his face despite the dire circumstances. Linux's antenna twitched in what Arthur had come to recognize as her equivalent of a smile. Let's not celebrate yet, she cautioned, even as she began the launch sequence. We still need to get off this planet. As the spacecraft's engines roared to life, Arthur strapped himself into the co-pilot seat. He watched in awe as Linux's hands danced over the controls, guiding the ship out of the hangar and into Zephyria's turbulent atmosphere. The ship bucked and shuddered as they ascended, fighting against gale-force winds and chunks of ice the size of small buildings. Arthur's knuckles turned white as he clutched the armrests, his eyes fixed on the rapidly receding surface of the planet. Just as they broke through the cloud layer, a massive explosion lit up the horizon behind them. The gamelan outpost's power core had finally detonated, sending shockwaves that buffeted their small craft. Hold on, Linux shouted, her antenna flattened against her head as she fought to keep the ship stable. As the turbulence subsided and they climbed higher into Zephyria's upper atmosphere, a new threat appeared on their sensors. A much larger ship had entered orbit, its sleek design unmistakably gamelan. Arthur and Linux exchanged a look, both knowing that their trials were far from finished. As their small craft ascended towards the imposing gamelan vessel, they braced themselves for a confrontation that would shape the future of human-gamelan relations. The rescue ship loomed larger in their view screen, its massive hull dwarfing their small craft. Arthur could see intricate patterns etched into its surface, pulsing with a soft blue light that seemed to ripple across the ship's exterior. They're hailing us, Linux said, her antenna twitching nervously as she reached for the communication controls. Panel. Arthur held his breath, tension radiating through his body, as Linux's lavender fingers hovered over the controls. This is Gamelan Warship Zenith, a deep, authoritative voice boomed through the speakers. Unidentified vessel, you are in restricted space. Power down your engines and prepare to be brought aboard. Arthur's eyes widened as he glanced at Linux. Her antenna drooped, a clear sign of distress. "It's Admiral Zex," she whispered, her voice trembling. "One of our most decorated military leaders." Before Arthur could respond, a shudder ran through their small craft. A pale blue light enveloped them, and he felt a strange weightlessness as their ship began to move against Lennox's control. "Tractor beam," Lennox explained, her hands falling away from the useless controls. "We can't break free." They watched in tense silence as the massive warship grew larger in their view screen. Its hull gleamed with an otherworldly blue sheen, intricate patterns pulsing with energy. As they drew closer, Arthur could make out the cavernous opening of a docking bay. Their small craft was pulled inside with surprising gentleness. As soon as they touched down, the docking bay doors slid shut behind them with a resounding clang. "Arthur," Lennox said, her silver eyes meeting his, "whatever happens, remember that my feelings for you are real." Before he could respond, the ship's hatch hissed open. They were immediately surrounded by a dozen Gamellon soldiers, their weapons trained on Arthur. A tall, imposing figure strode forward, his elaborate uniform marking him as the leader. Admiral Zex's piercing gaze swept over them, lingering on the point where Lennox's hand was intertwined with Arthur's. "Lieutenant Lennox," the Admiral's voice was cold. "Explain yourself." Lennox stepped forward, her antenna quivering but her voice steady. "Admiral, I can explain. The human, Arthur, he—" "Silence!" Zex barked, his eyes narrowing. "You dare to consort with this creature? To form an intimate bond? This is an outrage." Murmurs of shock and disgust rippled through the assembled Gamellon soldiers. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the full implications of their situation. "Take the human for interrogation," Zex ordered, his voice dripping with contempt. Two soldiers immediately moved to flank Arthur. "No!" Lennox cried out, reaching for Arthur as the soldiers began to pull him away. "Please, you don't understand." Admiral Zex raised a hand, silencing her protest. "You, Lieutenant, will report to medical for a full examination. We must determine the extent of your contamination." As Arthur was led away, he caught one last glimpse of Lennox. The conflict in her eyes was clear, torn between her duty to her people and her feelings for him. Then the doors slid shut, cutting off his view. The interrogation room was stark and cold, its metallic walls seeming to absorb all warmth. Arthur sat rigidly in a chair that seemed designed for discomfort, facing Admiral Zex across a gleaming table. "You humans," Zex began, his tone a mixture of curiosity and disdain, "have advanced much faster than we anticipated. Tell me, how did you manage to reach Zephyria?" Arthur swallowed hard, weighing his words carefully. "It was an accident," he explained. "A malfunction in our experimental drive system. We never intended to—" "Lies!" Zex smacked his head on the table. "We've been monitoring your planet for years. Your species is a powder keg of violence and unpredictability. Your presence here is no accident." As the interrogation continued, Arthur's mind raced. The Gamellons had been watching Earth? For how long? And what did this mean for the future of human-Gamellon relations? Meanwhile, in the medical bay, Lennox lay on an examination table, surrounded by curious doctors. Their instruments hummed and beeped as they scanned her body, murmurs of surprise growing louder with each passing moment. "Fascinating," one doctor muttered, reviewing a holographic display. "Her genetic structure has undergone subtle but significant changes." Another doctor leaned in, his antenna twitching with excitement. "It appears her prolonged exposure to the human has activated dormant genes. These adaptations, they've made her more biologically compatible with humans." The news spread through the ship like wildfire. Lennox's transformation became the subject of heated debates in every corner of the warship. Some crew members recoiled in horror, seeing it as a corruption of their species. Others, particularly younger Gamellons, were intrigued by the possibilities it presented. Back in the detention area, Arthur found an unexpected ally in a young guard named Vex. The junior officer's curiosity about humans outweighed his initial wariness. "Is it true that you have no antenna?" Vex asked in a hushed tone, glancing around to ensure no one overheard. Arthur nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips despite the grim situation. "That's right. We communicate solely through speech and body language. As they talked, Arthur learned more about Gamelon society, their strict hierarchy, their ongoing war with a mysterious alien race, and their deep-seated fear of outside contamination. This context helped him understand the shock his relationship with Linux had caused. Hours later, the door to Arthur's cell slid open. Linux stood there, flanked by guards, but allowed a brief visit. Their eyes met, conveying a depth of emotion words couldn't express. "Arthur," Linux said softly, stepping closer. "The Admiral is convening a council to decide our fate. But more than that, they're debating the future of human-Gamelon relations." Arthur reached out, taking her hand in his. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." Their moment was cut short by a shrill alarm that echoed through the ship. Red lights began to flash, and the vessel shuddered beneath their feet. Admiral Zex's voice boomed over the intercom, tension evident even through the speakers. "All hands to battle stations. The salvage team has activated an ancient weapon system on Zephyria. If we don't deactivate it immediately, entire solar systems could be destroyed." Linux and Arthur exchanged a look of shock and purpose. As chaos erupted around them, they knew that the next few hours would determine not just their fate, but potentially the fate of countless worlds. The ship's engines roared to life, and Arthur felt the familiar lurch of acceleration as the warship turned back towards Zephyria. In the midst of this new crisis, he and Linux found themselves thrust into the heart of the action, their unique combination of skills suddenly invaluable in the face of impending catastrophe. Catastrophe. The ship's corridors erupted into a flurry of activity as crew members rushed to their stations, the urgency of the situation overriding any lingering tension surrounding Arthur and Linux's presence. Admiral Zex's voice crackled over the intercom once more. "Linux, bring the human to the bridge immediately. We need all hands for this crisis." Arthur and Linux exchanged a quick glance before following their armed escort through the labyrinthine passages of the Gamelon warship. The deck plates vibrated beneath their feet as the massive engines engaged, pushing the vessel back towards Zephyria. As they entered the bridge, Arthur's eyes widened at the sight before him. A vast holographic display dominated the center of the room, showing Zephyria surrounded by a pulsating energy field that seemed to grow more unstable with each passing second. Admiral Zex turned to face them, his antenna twitching with nearly unleashed agitation. "The salvage team activated an ancient weapon system embedded deep within the planet's core. If we don't deactivate it immediately, the resulting chain reaction could destroy entire solar systems." Linux stepped forward, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "Admiral, I have extensive knowledge of ancient Gamelon technology. I can assist with the deactivation process." Zex nodded curtly, then fixed his gaze on Arthur. "And you, human. Your unique perspective may prove useful. You will both join the team I'm sending to the surface." Within minutes, Arthur found himself strapped into a specialized shuttle alongside Linux and a team of Gamelon engineers. The craft shuddered as it broke free from the warship's docking bay, plunging towards Zephyrria's turbulent atmosphere. "Brace for impact," the pilot warned as they entered the swirling energy field. The shuttle bucked violently, alarms blaring as systems struggled to compensate for the intense electromagnetic interference. Arthur's stomach lurched as they made a rough landing on Zephyria's icy surface. The team quickly donned protective suits designed to shield them from the planet's harsh environment before venturing out onto the windswept landscape. "The weapons control center is located deep within the planet's core," one of the engineers, Krell, explained as they trudged through knee-deep snow. "We'll need to navigate a network of ancient tunnels to reach it." As they approached the entrance to the tunnel system, Arthur noticed the Gamelons struggling with the slick, icy terrain. Drawing on his experience from Earth's polar regions, he demonstrated how to adjust their gait for better traction. "Fascinating," Krell muttered, his antenna twitching with interest as he mimicked Arthur's movements. "Your species' adaptability is impressive." The group descended into the tunnels, the temperature dropping further as they ventured deeper into Zephyria's crust. Linux took point, her knowledge of ancient Gamelon script proving invaluable as they deciphered worn markings and navigated treacherous intersections. Suddenly, the tunnel ahead erupted with a blinding flash of light. Arthur instinctively dove for cover, pulling Krail down with him as a swarm of metallic orbs filled the air, emitting searing energy beams. "Automated defenses," Linux shouted, her voice barely audible over the chaos. "They're targeting non-Gamelon biosignatures." The Gamelon team formed a protective circle around Arthur, their weapons raised against the onslaught of defensive drones. Linux worked feverishly at a nearby control panel, her fingers dancing across alien symbols as she attempted to disable the security system. In the midst of the firefight, Arthur spotted a drone sneaking up behind Krill. Without hesitation, he lunged forward, tackling the Gamelon engineer to the ground as an energy beam sizzled through the air where Krell's head had been moments before. Krell stared at Arthur, his silver eyes wide with shock and a newfound respect. Before he could speak, Linux's voice rang out triumphantly. "I've done it! The defenses are down!" As the group pressed on, the dynamics had shifted subtly. The Gamelon engineers now looked to Arthur with a mix of curiosity and grudging admiration, peppering him with questions about human ingenuity and survival instincts. They finally arrived at a vast chamber deep within the planet's core, its walls pulsing with an eerie blue light. At the center stood a towering crystalline structure, tendrils of energy arcing between its facets. "The weapons control system," Linux breathed, approaching the structure with a mixture of awe and trepidation. "It requires a direct neural interface to initiate the shutdown sequence." Krell frowned, consulting a handheld device. "The energy emissions are too intense. A pure Gamelon attempting the interface would suffer severe neural damage." Linux's antenna drooped as realization dawned. "My physiology, the changes from my contact with Arthur, I might be able to withstand the interface." Arthur's heart clenched with fear. "Linux, no, it's too dangerous." She turned to him, her silver eyes filled with grit, and something deeper, more tender. "Arthur, I have to try. The fate of countless worlds depends on it." As Linux prepared to interface with the ancient weapon, Arthur refused to leave her side, despite the protests of the Gamelon team. Moved by their unwavering bond, Krell and the others worked swiftly to modify a protective suit for Arthur, allowing him to remain in the chamber during the procedure. Linux stepped up to the crystalline structure, placing her hands on its smooth surface. As the neural link engaged, her body went rigid, a cry of pain escaping her lips. Arthur stood beside her, his hand on her shoulder, offering what support he could as she battled against the weapon's defenses. "You can do this, Linux," Arthur urged, his voice steady despite the fear gripping his heart. "I'm here with you. We're in this together." The chamber filled with a blinding light as Linux pushed through the final barriers, her unique neural patterns allowing her to outmaneuver the weapon's AI defenses. With a deafening roar, the energy field surrounding Zephyria began to dissipate. As the light faded, Linux collapsed into Arthur's arms, unresponsive. The Gamelon medical team rushed forward, their expressions grim as they assessed her condition. "We need to get her back to the ship immediately," Dr. Vela announced, her antenna flat against her head in concern. "The neural interface has caused significant damage. Her vital signs are critical." Arthur cradled Linux's limp form as they raced back to the shuttle, his mind a whirl of fear and desperate hope. As they broke atmosphere, he could see the Gamelon warship waiting in orbit, its medical bay already prepped for their arrival. Admiral Zex's voice came through the shuttle's comm system, lacking its usual stern edge. "Report on Lieutenant Linux's condition." As Dr. Vela detailed Linux's status, Arthur noticed the concern in the Admiral's tone. It seemed that even Zex wasn't immune to the impact of Linux's sacrifice. The shuttle docked with a gentle thud, and Arthur found himself running alongside the medical team as they rushed Linux to the intensive care unit. Dr. Vela turned to him as they reached the medical bay doors. "Your presence seems to have a stabilizing effect on her readings," the doctor said, her antenna twitching thoughtfully. "You may stay, but you must follow our instructions precisely." As Arthur took his place beside Linux's bed, holding her hand while the medical team worked feverishly around them, he sensed a shift in the atmosphere. The Gamelon crew members who entered the medical bay no longer looked at him with suspicion or disgust, but with a newfound curiosity and respect. Admiral Zex appeared in the doorway, his imposing figure softened slightly by the concern evident in his posture. "We're en route to our nearest advanced medical facility," he informed Arthur. "Once Lieutenant Lennox's condition stabilizes, we will convene a council to discuss." Admiral Zex's voice trailed off as the ship's alarms blared once again. Dr. Vela's antenna twitched in alarm as she studied the monitors surrounding Lennox's bed. "Her neural patterns are destabilizing," Dr. Vela announced, her fingers flying over the control panels. "The damage from the weapon's interface is progressing more rapidly than anticipated." Arthur tightened his grip on Lennox's hand, his heart racing as he watched the medical team spring into action. The Gamelon warship's engines thrummed with increased intensity as they pushed towards the advanced medical facility, but Arthur could sense the growing tension in the room. They might not make it in time. Dr. Vela's antenna suddenly perked up, her silver eyes widening with a spark of inspiration. "There might be another way," she said, turning to face Arthur. "Your unique physiology, the very thing that allowed Lennox to interface with the weapon, it could be the key to saving her." Arthur leaned forward, hope mingling with apprehension. "What do you mean?" The doctor's fingers danced over a holographic display, bringing up a complex diagram of intertwining DNA strands. "We could attempt an experimental procedure, using your DNA to further adapt Lennox's physiology. It might heal the neural damage, but—" She hesitated, her antenna drooping slightly. "The procedure is untested. There's no guarantee of success, and the potential consequences for both of you are unknown." Without hesitation, Arthur nodded. "I'll do it, whatever it takes." Admiral Zex, who had been silently observing from the doorway, stepped forward. His imposing figure seemed to fill the room, but when he spoke, his voice carried an unexpected note of admiration. "Your dedication is commendable, human. You have my permission to proceed with the procedure." As the medical team rushed to prepare, word of the unprecedented event spread through the ship like wildfire. Curious Gamelons began to gather outside the medical bay, their antenna twitching with a mixture of excitement and apprehension. Arthur found himself lying on a bed adjacent to Lennox, surrounded by a dizzying array of pulsing Gamelon technology. Dr. Vela's voice seemed to come from far away as she explained the procedure, but Arthur's focus remained on Lennox's pale, still form beside him. "Initiating DNA transfer," Dr. Vela announced, and Arthur felt a strange tingling sensation course through his body. The world around him began to blur, colors swirling and merging in a kaleidoscope of light. Suddenly, Arthur found himself standing on the icy surface of Zephyria, the wind whipping around him. But this time, he wasn't alone. Lennox stood beside him, her silver eyes wide with wonder. "Arthur," she whispered, reaching out to touch his face. "How is this possible?" Before he could respond, the scene shifted. They were in the tunnels beneath Zephyria's surface, surrounded by the pulsing blue light of the ancient weapon. Arthur watched in awe as moments from their shared experiences flashed before his eyes. Their first meeting, the quiet conversations in his cell, the heart-pounding race to save countless worlds. The visions came faster now, a whirlwind of images and sensations. Arthur caught glimpses of Lennox's childhood on a Gamelon colony world, felt the weight of her responsibilities as a young officer. In turn, he sensed her experiencing flashes of his life on Earth, the thrill of his first deep space mission, the loneliness of the long journey to Zephyria. As the torrent of shared memories began to slow, Arthur became aware of a new sensation. He could feel Lennox's presence more strongly than ever before, as if a part of her now resided within him. The final vision that materialized before them was unlike any they had seen, a glimpse of a possible future. Arthur saw himself and Lennox standing side by side on the bridge of a ship, surrounded by a crew of both humans and Gamelons, all working together in harmony. The vision faded, and Arthur found himself back in the Gamelon medical bay, the steady beep of monitors filling his ears. He turned his head, his body feeling strangely heavy, to see Lennox lying motionless beside him. The medical team hovered nearby, their antenna twitching nervously as they studied the readings. For a moment, nothing happened. Arthur's heart sank, fear gripping him, as he wondered if they had been too late. Then as he reached out to take Lennox's hand, her vital signs suddenly spiked. Her fingers twitched in his grasp, and slowly her eyes fluttered open. "Arthur," Lennox whispered, her voice weak but clear. The medical bay erupted in cheers. Dr. Vela's antennae were practically vibrating with excitement as she rushed to examine Lennox. "It worked!" she exclaimed. "Her neural patterns are stabilizing. The damage is repairing itself." As news of the procedure's success spread, the atmosphere on the ship transformed. The gathered crowd outside the medical bay broke into spontaneous celebration, their earlier suspicion of Arthur replaced by awe and gratitude. Admiral Zex strode into the room, his usual stern demeanor softened by the hint of a smile. "It seems we owe you a great debt, human," he said, inclining his head towards Arthur. "Your actions have not only saved Lieutenant Lennox, but have opened our eyes to possibilities we never imagined." He paused, his antenna twitching thoughtfully. "I believe it's time we reconsidered our stance on human-Gamelon relations. I will be calling for a formal diplomatic meeting with Earth's representatives immediately." In the days that followed, as Lennox regained her strength and Arthur adjusted to the subtle changes in his own physiology, the Gamelon warship became a hub of cultural exchange. Crew members who had once eyed Arthur with suspicion now sought him out eagerly, eager to learn about human customs and share their own. Lennox, her unique status as a bridge between human and Gamelon biology now cemented, found herself serving as a trusted advisor to Admiral Zex. Together, she and Arthur began to lay the groundwork for a new era of cooperation between their peoples. As the ship prepared to rendezvous with the approaching Earth delegation, Arthur and Lennox stood together in a quiet observation deck, gazing out at the star-filled expanse before them. Their hands were intertwined, a physical representation of the bond that now connected them on a level deeper than either had thought possible. "What do you think will happen now?" Lennox asked softly, her silver eyes reflecting the starlight. Arthur squeezed her hand gently, a smile playing at his lips. "I'm not sure," he admitted, "but whatever comes next, we'll face it together, just like we always have." As they turned back to watch the approaching lights of the Earth ships, both felt a sense of anticipation and hope. The journey that had begun on the icy wastes of Zephyria was just getting started, but now it held the promise of a future neither of them could have imagined. A future where the boundaries between their two species might finally begin to blur.
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.